Well, it's good to have everyone here tonight in person. Sunday morning and Wednesday night just gets looking even better and better the more people that we get back. So it's good to have everyone back tonight. Good to have everyone coming in via the internet, Facebook, YouTube, whatever avenue that they're using to be with us tonight. We are going to finish up Nehemiah tonight. So Lord willing, we'll be done with this. And then next week I will be on vacation next Wednesday. Brother Terry's going to cover it next Wednesday. And then the next Wednesday, Brother Chad is going to do the Bible study for us. And then the next Wednesday we have our quarterly business meeting. And then the week after that we will dive into we'll dive into James. So looking forward to that. I think that's it as far as announcements. There won't be any Sunday night discussion this Sunday night. We will have that again the first Sunday night in August, but no Sunday night discussion this Sunday. So, anybody remember anything we talked about last week? Last week, we're kind of wrapping it up. Huh? He had to go back, right? Nehemiah went back. We don't know why he decided to go back. It's possible that he had heard about what was going on there and decided to go back. We don't know why he chose to go back. But when he went back, what did he find? They wasn't doing what they're supposed to be doing. All the promises, all the covenants that they had vowed that they would keep, they had broken all of them. We don't know how long he was gone. It's estimated anywhere from 2 to 9 years that he was gone before returning. And of course we know when he returned, we found that they were allowing the Ammonites and the Moabites to worship in the Holy Temple, right? And the Ammonites and the Moabites, they had prevented Israel from entering the promised land, or tried to prevent Israel from entering the promised land. They had enlisted Balaam to try to curse them, right? So they were not friends and did not belong there in the temple. Who else didn't belong in the temple complex that was there? Tobiah, right? We know he opposed everything that was going on, right? Yep, Eliashib, the high priest, had allowed him to move in and kind of set up an apartment there. And set up an apartment in one of the storerooms. And we know that he was able to set up an apartment in one of the storerooms because the storerooms were empty, right? Because the people had not been giving to the work of the Lord, which they had vowed to do. Nehemiah showed up. He had a portion of the law read, which immediately convicted the people. They took action. It says that they separated themselves from the mixed people, meaning those that were non-believers, the Ammonites and the Moabites. They separated themselves from those people. We also that Nehemiah got busy, right? He went in there and evicted Tobiah from his apartment, right? Threw all of his stuff out there. And he started gathering up the temple servants. The temple servants were not in the temple ministering and serving because they had to go to the fields, had to return to the fields to provide for themselves because people had not faithfully given the way that they should. So we see two major sins there. We see the sin of compromise, worshiping with the non-believers there. And we also see the sin of selfishness, as they did not give to God's house or the ministry of the temple as they should. So let's pick up reading tonight, Nehemiah chapter 13, beginning in verse 15. In those days I saw people in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in the sheaves and loading donkeys with wine, grape, figs, and all kinds of burdens, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. Nehemiah is making it very clear here, right? He says, in those days I saw in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath, right? And then he talks about all the other things, and Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. He was stressing the fact that they were doing this on the Sabbath day, which they should not have been. And he said, and I warned them about that day on which they were selling provisions. Men of Tyre dwelt there also, who brought in fish and all kinds of goods and sold them on the Sabbath to the children of Judah and in Jerusalem. Remember, that was one of the vows that they had made. That was one of the covenants, that they would keep the Sabbath holy, that they would not buy and sell on the Sabbath. Then I contended with the nobles of Judah and said to them, what evil thing is this that you do by which you profane the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers do this, and did not our God bring all this disaster on us and on this city? Yet you bring added wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. So it was at the gates of Jerusalem, as it began to get dark before the Sabbath, that I commanded the gates to be shut. So what is he doing here? He's locking down the city, right? Locking down the city the night before the Sabbath, right? And then I commanded the gates to be shut and charged that they must not be opened until after the Sabbath. Then I posted some of my servants at the gates so that no burden would be brought in on the Sabbath day. Now the merchants and the sellers of all kinds of wares lodged themselves outside Jerusalem once or twice. Then I warned and said to them, why do you spend the night around the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands on you. From that time on, they came no more on the Sabbath. And I commanded the Levites that they should cleanse themselves and that they should go and guard the gates to sanctify the Sabbath day. Remember me, O my God, concerning this also, and spare me according to the greatness of your mercy. So the people had began to defile the Sabbath day again. It's obvious that these people were more concerned about making money than keeping the Sabbath day holy. What we see here is a sin of materialism. Nehemiah saw the Jews. They were buying and they were selling and they were carrying around merchandise. They were just as busy on the Sabbath day, the day that was set apart for them to worship, as any other day. Nehemiah said that the people profaned, or they had not respected the Sabbath. Nehemiah reminds them there in verse 18 that it was for this same reason that God brought Judah into captivity. Jeremiah had prophesied that they would be judged by God through other nations for sins such as this. If they continued in this type of behavior, then they could expect to be judged by God. So what we see here is Nehemiah ordered that the gates would be shut. They would be shut on Saturday night, and they would not be opened up on the Sabbath. But still, verse 20, some of these merchants and sellers, they were pretty bold. What did they do? They set outside the walls to try to entice God's people to buy their goods and to commit sin. Nehemiah tells them there, he says, if you continue to do this, I will lay hands on you. Now remember, I said last week, he went in there, he didn't consult Eliashib about it. He didn't talk to Tobiah about it. He just went into the storeroom that Tobiah had taken up, turned into an apartment, and he just started throwing his stuff outside, right? How old did I say Nehemiah was? Probably about this time? About 70 years old. So now you see Nehemiah, he's probably standing on the edge of one of these gates somewhere, telling these sellers, you know what I mean, and these marketers, he says, listen, he said, if you continue, if you set up outside these walls one more time, I am going to lay hands on you. You think Nehemiah took this thing seriously? He was a bold man. And you know what? They must have, he must have come off pretty strong, because it says there at the end of verse 21, they came no more on the Sabbath. Nehemiah was a fella to handle, and he was making it very clear. Nehemiah put the Levites to work on cleansing themselves and guarding the gates and sanctifying them. There's an application for us. He set these gatekeepers up to keep things from happening that weren't supposed to be happening. He set up gatekeepers so that the people within the city, God's people, would not fall into sin. It is important in our lives that we set up gatekeepers in our lives. Things that will keep us from falling into sin, and things that will keep us from falling into temptation. There's all kinds of programs for what I feel sorry for our teenagers and even for our adults, but you have access to so much stuff on the internet now. Stuff that you used to have to pay for, sin you used to have to pay for, you can get for free, right, on the internet. But there's a lot of programs and stuff you can sit on your program on your phones and your tablets and your computers to serve as gatekeepers. We need accountability partners in our lives that can serve as gatekeepers, people that we can be real with. And I've talked about this, I don't know if it's been Wednesday nights, probably Wednesday nights and Sunday morning, but we need a group of people in our lives that we can be transparent with about things that we're struggling with and transparent about sin in our life. People that will hold us accountable for doing what's right. Be those gatekeepers, because we always have those weak moments, right? Nehemiah said, hey, listen, if there's one of those sellers out there and he's offering you some really good steaks for a cheap price, I'm going to make sure you don't go down there and sin on the Sabbath. I'm going to put a gatekeeper there. We're all going to have weak moments where things are going to try to entice us to do what's wrong, and we need gatekeepers in our life. And you don't have to be transparent with every single person in your life, but you need to be able to be transparent with a few people in your life that will guard you from things that you struggle with. And let me just say this. It's important that those gatekeepers in your life not struggle with exactly the same thing that you struggle with, right? They don't serve as very good gatekeepers, right? If I got a buddy that's struggling with something and I'm not doing so well, I'm not holding to my commitment, whatever that might be, and he's struggling with the same thing, and I come to him and I say, hey, man, listen, I blew it. He's going to be, hey, man, don't even worry about it. I blew it last week, right? You want somebody, that accountability partner, that's not going to be struggling with the same thing that you're struggling with. So we need gatekeepers. As strong as we think we are in our Christian faith, we need gatekeepers to keep us on the right track. That's why God gave us brothers and sisters in Christ. That's why God defines the life of a believer as a family and children of God, part of the family of God, because we should be there to encourage one another, to lean on one another, to pick one another up when we fall. I got a brother that messes up and he falls into some kind of sin, and I'm there not only to keep him from falling in, but if he does fall in, I'm there to help pick him up and dust him off and encourage him to get at it again. So let's continue reading here. Verse 23, in those days I also saw Jews who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab, and half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod and could not speak the language of Judah, but spoke according to the language of one or the other people. So I contended with them and cursed them, struck one of them, and pulled out their hair, and made them swear by God, saying, you shall not give your daughters as wives to their sons, nor take their daughters for sons of your wives. Once again, talking about those that, not of mixed nationality, but those of mixed beliefs. Did not believe the same as they did, not intermarrying with people that don't hold to the same values and the same God and the same truths that you do. Verse 26, did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin by these things? Yet among many nations there was no king like him, who was beloved of his God, and God made him king over all of Israel. Nevertheless, pagan women caused even him to sin. Nehemiah references one of the strongest kings of Israel, Solomon, one of the wisest men to ever walk the face of the earth, yet women were a downfall for him. And Nehemiah did not want his people to follow after him in that sense. Verse 27, should we then hear of you doing all this great evil, transgressing against our God by marrying pagan women? And one of the sons of Jehoiada, the son of Eliashib, the high priest, was a son-in-law of Sanballat the Horonite. Therefore I drove him from me. Verse 29, remember them, O my God, because they have defiled the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites. Thus I cleanse them of everything pagan. I think it's interesting here. Nehemiah says, hey, God, remember. Nehemiah could have said, hey, God, remember how I built the walls, right? Remember, God, how I populated the city when it was empty. But what did he say here? He says, God, remember that I have cleansed them of everything pagan. Nehemiah was focused on the spiritual things. Those were the things that were important. Now, not that building the walls wasn't important or populating the walls, but Nehemiah said, if you're going to remember anything, Lord God, remember that I held them to the spiritual truths and to doing what was right. He says, I also assigned duties to the priest and the Levites, each to his service, and to bring the wood offerings and the first fruits at appointed times. Remember me, O my God, for good. Now Nehemiah begins to deal with the disobedience that they had in intermarrying with these pagans. Once again, they had made a commitment to God that they would not give their children over to marry pagans, yet they had turned around and did the exact opposite. So much so that some of Judah's own people could not even speak their own language. They couldn't speak their language. They had become so ingrained with these pagan people that they now spoke their language and could not speak their own. It says that they intermarried with the Ashdod and the Ammonites and the Moab people. I want to remind you that the Ammonites, they sacrificed their children by fire to the god of Molech. So now we're intermarrying with people that isn't that they have a little bit different belief than us, a little different understanding of the Bible, but they're believing in something that is contrary to the Bible. They sacrifice their own children to the god of Molech, and we have all the archaeological evidence to prove this. Likewise, the Moabites, they also sacrificed their children to false gods. And Nehemiah is saying, and these are the kind of people that you're allowing your sons and daughters to be married to. It says that Nehemiah called down a curse on them. And I know we kind of have a different meaning of curse today, but anytime we see curse here, Nehemiah is talking about calling down the judgment of God, the chastisement of God on the people for the works that they had done. We see here that Nehemiah struck them and pulled their hair out. Okay. Now the pulling out of someone's hair was a showing of anger and insult. It was to mark them as someone to be scorned or someone to be judged. This I don't know. I don't know. He did go in there and start throwing Tobias stuff out of his room. He did go on the wall and tell everybody that if they didn't move off the wall or go back to where they come from, he's going to lay hands on them. So I'm not saying that Nehemiah didn't go out in the streets and start pulling some people's hair out of people that had intermarried or allowed their children to intermarry, but it's possible that this was like a public shaming. This was part of their culture when someone had did something that was wildly wrong. While I don't condemn running around hitting people over the head for sin or even pulling their hair out for sin, this does tell us that Nehemiah was very passionate about people not being fallen into sin and not seeing sin in people's lives. Nehemiah was not the kind of guy that was going to stand idly by and see people be involved in sin and allow their children to be involved in sin. His confrontation was very strong and it was very powerful. So we have Tobiah living in the temple complex here, and here we read that the high priest Eliashib, one of his grandsons, was married to Sanballat's daughter. Okay, once again. Throughout the book of Nehemiah, we see Sanballat and Tobiah, you know what I mean? Frick and frack, right? They were there together causing all sorts of problems in the wall, within the people of the wall, trying to stop the physical building of the wall, and then causing disunity and offering threats. You know, these were two of the greatest opposers of what God was doing, and yet the high priest has allowed his grandson to marry one of these opposers' daughter. This part of the Scripture just reminds me how important it is that we maintain godly marriages, that we maintain godly homes, that we maintain godly families. Not that we can control everything that goes on in our homes or in our families, but we should do our best. We should passionately protect our family and help them to see what is right and help them to do what is right. We have a responsibility to protect our families from being given over to Satan and take whatever measures are necessary to to protect them. And that's what we see here in Nehemiah's life. After cleansing the priesthood and reappointing temple leaders to the right task, it says that Nehemiah prayed. And we know that this should be no news to us, right? Because throughout this whole thing, from the very beginning until the very end, we see that Nehemiah was a man of prayer. He prayed short prayers. He prayed long prayers. He could be defined as a man of prayer. Because Nehemiah was a man of prayer, it made him a great spiritual leader. Prayer, the power of God and being dependent on the power of God, hard work allowed Nehemiah to accomplish all the things that God had intended for him to do in spite of so many difficult situations. As we have moved through this study, we have saw Nehemiah as a leader, probably someone that we can pattern our lives after, and I've talked a little bit about that, how we should be imitating Nehemiah as leaders in our homes, in our churches, and in our community. But I got just about, 5 or 6 points here about Nehemiah and his leadership that I just want to kind of summarize for you tonight as we wrap things up. First of all, Nehemiah was a man of responsibility. Right? Even in the very beginning, as the cupbearer, right, to King Artaxerxes, that was a position of responsibility. There was a great responsibility to make sure that the king did not get poisoned, right, by his food. So Nehemiah was a man of responsibility. We see how he steps up to the plate and takes responsibility in building these walls and delegating these walls and organizing the people and even correcting the people when they got wrong. So certainly Nehemiah was a man of responsibility. He was a man of vision. He was confident of who God was, and he knew that he could do what God had called him to do. He had a certainty about that. God gave him the vision, but he wasn't just simply a visionary, right? Now there are leaders that are like that, right? And I had those moments in my life where I'm just strictly a visionary. What am I saying? I got this great idea that I think we need to do. It's really great. I have no clue how to make it happen. Okay, that's a visionary. Okay, and there's times for that, and God brings all sorts of people in church so that y'all can help me figure out how to do what God has given us to do. But Nehemiah was more than just a visionary because he was a planner, right? And certainly there are times in my life where God gives me a vision for something, and then He gives me that sort of at least a snapshot of how we need to get started about doing that. And that was Nehemiah. He saw things through to its completion. There were a lot of times, Nehemiah had told King Artaxerxes, he said, listen, I'm going to come back, right? And he left when the project was over. But when they tried to kill Nehemiah, right? When they tried to discredit him, when he saw people, the people that he loved and God's people taking advantage of one another and abusing one another, Nehemiah could have just said, you know what? I'm done. You know what I mean? I'm going back to the palace, right? He could have just walked away, but he didn't do that. He was a person of perseverance, and he saw things through to the end, and that's certainly the way we do, because when God lays something on our hearts, He's not always going to make it easy for us. Now, if God gave us something to do and Satan just sits down and says, I'm going to let you do it, may be a chance that God isn't giving it to us to do, right? Because Satan's going to fight anything that God gives us to do. So keep that in mind. Certainly, as we've already alluded to, Nehemiah was a man of prayer. We see that throughout the Scripture. He was a man of action and cooperation. He realized what needed to be done. He explained to other people what needed to be done. He enlisted other people to help him. Once again, God gives you something to do. He's going to give you what you need to do it. And sometimes you've got to look for other people that can come alongside of you and fulfill what God has given you to do. Because a lot of times if God gives you a vision, if God gives you a heart for something, He's given somebody else a vision and a heart for that. And you get to talking to people, someone say, you know what, God's been leading me to do something like that too. Maybe we should try this together. So he's a man of action, a man of cooperation. He was a man of compassion when he saw the poor people in society being taken advantage of. When he saw the more wealthier people taking advantage, Nehemiah stood up for them. Nehemiah gave up his own wealth, right? When times were tight, when there wasn't a whole lot to eat, Nehemiah fed them his own food. It says that he set tables for the people. I forget how many people that he fed from his own table. He had compassion on people. He was a man that triumphed over opposition. He experienced ridicule. You'll see that in chapter 4, verse 3. They attempted to slander him. You'll see that in chapter 6, verses 4 through 7. They tried to give misleading messages, trying to accuse Nehemiah of saying something or doing something that he did not do, verses 10 through 14. But through all these things, Nehemiah was victorious because God had given him the work to do, and God was going to see him through. He had to hang in there and push through these difficulties, trusting in God and trusting in God's strength, God's provision, God's plan. So, anything else tonight before we move into our prayer time? Anybody have anything else to say about Nehemiah? Besides, we're glad it's over, right? We get to move into something else now. No. All right. And if you need any of these notes, if you need anything from that we've studied, you want to see it, I've got it all saved on my computer. It is not copyrighted by Pastor Dave because I pulled it from all sorts of sources to put it together. So anybody that wants this stuff, I'll give it to you. I got it in a file. Just send it over to you if you want it. So, all right. I've already weeks, vacation camp. Business annual meeting, and then we'll be back into the book of James. Going to start with sort of an introduction, sort of an overview of James the first week, and then we'll kind of do it like we did Nehemiah. Not that we'll necessarily go verse by verse, chapter by chapter, but we'll move through most of it. Pretty much all Nehemiah, we didn't read all the verses that had a lot of names in it because I wasn't going to try to pronounce all those. All right. So prayer time.